Hello and welcome to court. Whenever I post videos and I talk about enslavement, there's typically one or two comments that say, well, you know, slavery still exists, so... Which, I know that slavery still exists, but typically I'm talking about enslavement of black people historically. Comprehension. Where is she? She's not there. So today I wanted to talk about clothing and its relation between enslavement in America historically and today. I want to be very clear that in this video I'm specifically talking about enslavement in America. I know that we source out a lot of our clothing and textile work overseas for other slavery, but I'm specifically talking about enslavement that happens on United States soil. Not any enslavement that happens on any of those territories that were definitely a holdover from some weird manifest destiny colonial mess that America still likes to profit off of today. We're talking about the 50 states. Enslavement that happens here. There is going to be a lot of links in the description box below, so please check those out to cross-reference anything that I might talk about. In America, we have states in the South that we typically like to call the Bible Belt. It's typically a more conservative part of the country, although there are definitely pockets that are more liberal. But historically, that was called the Cotton Belt. This part of America was a very, very high exporter of cotton. Such a high exporter of cotton that at the beginning of the American Civil War, 59% of U.S. crop exports were cotton. 59% is a lot. It's a lot. This is at a time where most of America was undeveloped, so a lot of our land was farmland. The fact that most of the farmland in the South was being used specifically for cotton should say a lot about how much the United States as a whole relied on cotton as a resource. But this cotton wasn't produced in any fair or ethical manner. It was produced off of the backs of enslaved people who frankly went through hell. Chattel slavery in America is unlike any other slavery that you may have heard of in relation to people who were forced into enslavement in America. Chattel slavery means that you could not work your way out of enslavement. Your children could not work their way out of enslavement, and so on and so forth. If you were born a slave, more times than not, you would die in enslavement. That is regardless of your skill level. Now, there were people who were able to buy their way out of enslavement, but it was a very difficult process to do so, and a lot of people opted not to do so because they were leaving behind friends and family members. And friends doesn't seem like it would be that important, but many times enslaved people were sold away from family, so friends became their chosen family. The cotton industry was so important and so integral to the Cotton Belt that breeding farms were set up after it became illegal to bring more people over in the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage refers to the Atlantic slave trade. That's the Middle Passage, the passage between Africa and the Americas. Because cotton was such a huge export, the Civil War didn't really change that. It was still a major export during the Civil War and after the Civil War. I'm saying during the Civil War in quotes here because we know that a lot of the ports were shut off because there was a war happening and people wanted to really shut down the industry in the South because of, the enslavement and the war. Regardless, an industry like that isn't going to change overnight. There would have to be a lot of radical changes made to the system in order for there to be a huge shift. And quite frankly, textiles take a lot of work to produce. And the South did not have the income, did not have the infrastructure to pay people to produce cotton. So they didn't. After the war, for the most part, they didn't. After the war, a lot of enslaved people owed their human traffickers debts. Debts. These debts for food, water, housing, so on, so forth, were only put in place to make sure that enslaved people, or at this point supposed to be formerly enslaved people, could not leave. You owe debts to your human trafficker. It's unlawful for you to leave. And if you do try to leave, we'll make sure to get someone to catch you. While on paper, it looks like all of these people were freed and they could move about and live their lives in true freedom. In reality, that was not the case. And I've said this before, but in some cases, people chose to stay. They were ill. They had family members that were ill. They might have had small children. There were a lot of reasons why people would want to stay on a plantation, unfortunately. Because the Emancipation Proclamation didn't actually change the act of slavery being persistent in the textile industry, in the clothing industry in America, it continued well after slavery. So let's jump to today. There is a lot of different types of slave labor that is common in America today, but we're only going to focus on a couple in their relation to clothing. One is prison labor. In the United States, prisoners do not have to be paid minimum wage, which federal minimum wage, I believe, is $7.25 an hour. They don't even have to be paid a tipped wage, which hovers a little over $2 an hour. Typically in America, prisoners make under $1 an hour, despite the fact that the things that they need from the commissary, which is where you buy your soap and your toothpaste and food and basically a general store inside of the prison, cost well over $1. Inflation in prisons is absolutely ridiculous. There are a couple of articles linked below talking about companies that have been caught red-handed using prison labor as a way to manufacture goods and paying folks well under $1 to do so. Now, I want to be clear, when I say that this is happening in American prisons, I don't mean in offshore prisons. I mean on American soil. American soil. And it is often Americans doing this. It's very interesting how outside of prison, you're not supposed to be able to make less than the federal minimum wage, but in prison is fine. And before you say, well, maybe they should have thought about that before committing crime. 1, prisoners are people. They're people. 2, go ahead and admit that you don't believe in any rehabilitation. And 3, there are people in prison who were found guilty with very little evidence. Sometimes the evidence didn't point to them at all, and they get exonerated or they're able to appeal because they were never guilty. But they're learning really important skills that can be used once they serve their time. This is only helping them. That point actually brings me to the next type of enslavement we're going to talk about, which is wage slavery. CBC Marketplace did a really good study on where clothing comes from, and although it is based in Canada, the latter half of the video goes to sweatshops in America where wage slavery is happening. That's linked down below as well. Garment workers are often paid by the piece. So, for example, they might be paid 3 cents for every single shirt that they hem. Just an FYI, typically the wages are under 25 cents per whatever item needs to be sewn because there are so many items sewn in bulk. This is the company's reasoning, not mine. I think that they should be paid a fair wage, which means that they are nowhere close to reaching minimum wage. And it also means that people who serve their time in prison can't really use the skills that they learned in prison to get work to pay for probation officers, for court fees, for any fines that they might have to pay. They aren't actually learning a skill that's going to help them. It also means that Made in America labels, Made in the USA labels mean virtually nothing. I do want to note here, and I know we are talking about enslavement in America specifically, but I do want to note that you can put a Made in America label on something that was not technically produced in America. So if you are buying shirts from somewhere overseas, but you are hand dyeing them in America and you are embroidering them in America, you could put a Made in America label on it, even though it wasn't made in America. The system was built off of enslavement, and really nothing has been done to stop that terrible cycle from continuing. This is what systematic oppression and systematic racism looks like in action. So what can you do? You can support garment workers either directly or indirectly through organizations, I have a couple listed below, that help fight for fair wages, that help fight for back pay, that pay legal fees against these huge companies that operate under different names, of course, that pushes actionable legislation to make sure that we aren't continuing the systematic oppression for the next generation and the next generation and the next generation to come. But I do urge you to look at the links below. Check those out because there are some great organizations listed there. Also, check out the CBC Marketplace video that I listed because they also talk about an agency that is helping people fight this uphill battle. The fact of the matter is, at this point, we don't really have a way for 100% of clothing to be made by robots or by machines. We need a human element. And these humans need to be paid a living wage. And I want to ask the question, do you know where your clothing comes from? I mean the fabric, the thread, the everything. How were those beads made on your blouse? What about the buttons on your shirt? And it's okay not to know. But I think just posing that question really puts into frame how little we know about where our clothing comes from. And I think we know very little because people don't want us to know. Thank you for watching. Until next time.